Hello and welcome to today's presentation. My name is Robin Faria. I'm the Director of Operations for the UCLA CTSI's Grant Submission Unit, and today we're going to talk about practical approaches to human subjects and clinical trials research, and specifically related to grant applications with an emphasis on NIH grant applications that require or involve human subjects and/or clinical trials. So first of all, when you're looking for whether your application is going to involve human subjects or clinical trials, there's a few questions you want to go through first, including what is human subjects research? So to answer this question, first we need to ask ourselves, is it research? And this is defined as efforts that exclude things such as scholarly or journalistic activities that focus on specific individuals or for public health surveillance purposes, etc. So if your research falls under any of these categories, it's not necessarily considered human subjects research. However, if your topic falls out of this area, the next question to ask yourself is, does that research involve human subjects? So human subjects are defined as somebody that must be a living individual about whom an investigator is conducting research. And this includes whether you obtain information or biospecimens or both, either through an intervention or an interaction, or you're obtaining, using, or analyzing these components and their identifiable private information and or biospecimens. So after that, the next question that you want to look at is that research exempt from human subjects protections? So this can include things like secondary use of research, use for educational tests or surveys, etc. And I'll go into more detail about what exemptions mean in a little bit, but in essence, if you answer, yes, it is human subject research, it does involve human subjects, and it is not exempt from human subjects, then there are a number of protections you have to put in place when you're applying for federal funds, such as for NIH grant applications. And so this presentation is going to walk you through some of those questions. If you answer yes to all of these, the next question is your study a clinical trial? So there are a series of 4 questions that the NIH provides to help you determine whether your study is a clinical trial or not. First question is, does that study involve human subjects? If yes, are the participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? And then the third question is the study designed to evaluate the effect of the intervention on the participants? And the last question is the effect that will be evaluated a health-related, biomedical, or behavioral outcome? So if you end up answering yes to all 4 of these questions, your study is a clinical trial, even if it doesn't involve drug or device or anything that might traditionally be included in a clinical trial. So if you're still unsure after these 4 questions, the NIH has case studies available on the website provided here, and you can go look at those and look at studies that are maybe similarly designed to yours to determine if NIH had defined those as clinical trials or not. And in addition, they also have resources to help you determine, is your particular intervention actually an intervention, or is it more of an observation? You know, what is the definition of prospective assignment? So it helps you kind of define these things if you have studies where you're really not sure if your study is a clinical trial, even after answering these 4 questions. And later on in the presentation, we will talk through some specifics of the protections that you need to be aware of and have in place if your study does meet the definition of a clinical trial. So for the NIH in particular, knowing whether your study involves human subjects and or whether it includes a clinical trial also means that you have to be aware of choosing the right funding opportunity announcement for the particular study that you're planning. So what I have listed here is a series of different parent grants that exist for R01s within the NIH. And what you'll notice is they have 3 separate categories, one of which a clinical trial would be required, another where a clinical trial would not be allowed, and then a third newer one called basic experimental studies with humans required. And I'll just let you know that if you determine that your study really is a basic experimental study of human subjects, you would, in effect, be answering yes to all of the clinical trials questions. But because the NIH recognizes that sometimes those types of studies are really not formal clinical trials, they do have a separate FOA for you, although the requirements for both the BESH studies and the clinical trials are identical. And just another thing to be aware of is that for the clinical trial FOAs, not all NIH agencies participate in the parent grant. So National Cancer Institute, for instance, has their own R01. And so just to be aware that when you're planning your study, you really have to choose your funding opportunity carefully based on the type of study that you're planning, and to make sure that the agency that you want to submit it to is actually participating in the particular FOA that you've identified. So depending on whether your study involves human subjects and or a clinical trial, there's a couple of different types of human subject studies that will define the types of requirements that are involved for your particular application. So we'll go through each of these individually, but the first one, easiest, when there's no human subjects involved. However, there are some instances in which you will select no to human subjects, even though you might be using some humans, biospecimens, and or data, and we'll talk about that next. The second one would be exempt human subjects research, which I referred to earlier. The third, delayed onset human subject studies. And then the last and most common one would be for non-exempt human subject studies. If you have a non-exempt human subject study in which you answered yes to all 4 of the previous questions, then your study would also be considered a clinical trial. So the first of these is no to human subjects. So the NIH has a category where your study is not considered human subjects, but you are using data or specimens. So the requirements for this are essentially that you have to provide an explanation of who is providing the data or biological specimens to you for your study, what is their role, if any, on the proposed research. So for instance, are they a totally unaffiliated third party that's just providing them to you, or is this person who's providing them to you a co-investigator or researcher on the grant that you're applying for? And then describe the identifiers, if any, that'll be associated with the data or biospecimens that are being provided to you, as well as describing who has access to the subject's identities. So through all of this, you want to describe and make sure that it's very clear how the privacy of the research participants and the confidentiality of their data will be protected. If you cannot clearly answer these questions, then your study does not fall under this particular category. So just something to keep in mind, that essentially you want to make sure that in all instances you are protecting human subjects' data, biospecimens, and there's appropriate protections in place depending on the type of data and specimens that are being provided or utilized. So after this section, for this type of study, essentially what you're doing is creating a justification for why you believe your study, even though you're using data or biospecimens, falls under the category of no to human subjects. And it's really about making sure that there's appropriate separation between the original data and who has access to it, the people who initially collected it, and who's going to be accessing it on your particular project. The next type of human subjects research is exempt human subjects research. So there are a number of exemption categories, and these include things like educational practices, tests, surveys, and interviews, secondary research on the use of identifiable private information, research on public benefits, taste and food quality, etc. So with these, they're not saying that this is not human subjects, it's just that this particular use of human subjects is exempt from protections that you would have to describe in your application. If you're involved in clinical research or at an academic university, the most common one that you're going to see is secondary research, or secondary use of research. And what this usually means is that there is existing data or biospecimens, maybe remnant tissue left over from previous studies, that you then have access to. And because it's been collected for a different purpose, not for the purposes specifically for your study, you may be able to claim exemption for that, depending on how your protections are in place for those data. So the third type of human subjects research is called delayed onset justification. And there's a couple of requirements and definitions you need to meet this definition. So for delayed onset justification, this is for applications in which the human subject's information is not available at the time of application. So examples of this could be you're applying for a planning grant, and the first phase of that award is going to determine what your study subject population looks like, and so you're not able to determine that at the time of the application. Another example would be you're applying for a grant that has some pilot award components, and you don't know at the time of application exactly what those pilot awards could be. Some could be human subjects, some could be even clinical trials, but you don't necessarily know what disease is being studied or what study population. And so in order to fill out the human subjects requirements for protection, you don't have a lot of that information available at the time of the application itself. So if you believe your study meets this definition, then the requirements you have to meet are you have to certify and explain in detail that the protection of human subjects requirements will be met before the start of any study that's funded under your application. You have to acknowledge any good clinical practice requirements and verify that all personnel will meet those requirements before the start of any study. And if you anticipate that your study will be a multi-site study with multiple domestic sites, you do need to include a single IRB plan. If you anticipate that your delayed onset study will potentially be classified as a clinical trial, then you also have to include a dissemination plan for how you're going to ensure that you're registering the study with clinicaltrials.gov in an appropriate time. And with all that being said, I just want to point out that the delayed onset justification is not the same thing as a delayed start study. So a delayed start just means you're not going to start the study right away, but that you still have an understanding of what your study population is going to be. Only use delayed onset as a definition if you're really not able to determine the human subjects information at the time of the application itself. So the fourth type of study, and this is obviously the most common one for UCLA and our CTSI partners, is non-exempt human subjects. So this is research involving human subjects that are not exempt from protections, meaning you do have to provide protections in place. And so what I'm going to do with this presentation is kind of walk you through some of the high-level requirements for those applications. So if you have a non-exempt human subjects research project that you're planning, the first section you want to think about is the study population characteristics. So for this section, you want to talk about what the condition or focus is of the study. Eligibility criteria includes both the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And just a note for those of you that are familiar with NIH applications in the past, in 2018, NIH updated some of its human subject requirements. This section would have formerly been included in the protection of human subjects document. It's now its own separate section, and you do have to list it separately. So eligibility criteria. After that, inclusion of women, minorities, and across the lifespan. Again, this used to be two separate documents, one called inclusion of women and minorities, and one called inclusion of children. Recently, NIH has updated inclusion of children to be called inclusion across the lifespan, meaning that if you are excluding any participants based on age, either in the pediatric age range or in the upper age range, say for participants over 65, there has to be a scientific justification. So they've renamed this inclusion across the lifespan and combined those two documents into one. A recruitment and retention plan is now required. Recruitment used to be included in the protection of human subjects section, and now it's its own section, and they've tacked on additional clarifications for retention. So if your study involves seeing participants at more than one time point, you should include a retention plan that discusses how you're going to retain them over time, ensure that they're able to get to the study. If there's particular study populations that are hard to reach or hard to retain, have additional justifications for how you're going to address that, and talk and justify it based on previous experience in similar studies and the specific demographics of the population that you're working with. So with the inclusion document, recruitment and retention plan, for the NIH applications, these are separate documents. They do not have page limitations, so you can be as thorough as you need to for these sections. Recruitment status is where you just clarify if you're not yet recruiting, enrolling only by invitation, etc. There's a number of drop-down options for you to select from. And then another new requirement as of 2018 is the study timeline. So this is not necessarily the same as your application timeline where you talk about when you will achieve aims 1, 2, and 3, but really for the human subjects that you are seeing, what are the time points? And NIH asks for you to be not too specific, so you don't have to list specific years or months of your study, but you should have, you know, approximately when your study startup procedures will take place, you know, 3 to 6 months for IRB approval, et cetera. What is the anticipated rate of enrollment for your patients? So what time point are you getting 25% enrollment, 50, 75, 100? Do you have time for data analysis at the end, et cetera? This can be done narratively, or you can do it visually, or a combination of both. Again, there's no space limitation for this document, so it can be as lengthy as it needs to be, depending on the length, number of years, or time points in your application. And then the inclusion enrollment report is also required. So where you do breakdown of the gender, racial, ethnic breakdown that you've previously discussed in your inclusion of women and minorities section, you outline in a table in this section. After study population characteristics, the next section is protection and monitoring plans. And this is really how you are going to ensure that patients' health and well-being is protected, as well as their data, of course. So the protection of human subjects document is still a required component, and it is still not page limited. So depending on the risks involved with your subjects for the particular studies, this may be lengthier if it's a more risky procedure, etc. And but just a warning that a lot of those sections that I just previously discussed are no longer required for this section, and that you shouldn't be duplicative. So feel free to pull out the eligibility information and put it in the eligibility criteria section. Next is a single IRB. So if you anticipate that your study is going to be a multi-site domestic, and that those multi-sites are domestic sites, you are required to include a single IRB plan. Data and safety monitoring plan is required. You may also be required to have a board, or you may elect to have a board depending on the risks involved with your human subjects. That is a separate upload from the protection of human subjects document, so those need to be separated out. Overall structure of the study team is a new requirement as of 2018 as well. And this one is really asking you for what is the structure of your team in terms of the sites that are going to be involved? So especially if you have a multi-site study, but who's in charge of the administrative components? Who are the enrolling sites and recruitment sites? Are you using any particular labs or other resources? And you can do this visually, narratively. Again, it's not asking for an org chart of who's the PI, who's working for the PI, who's running which cores. It's really more based on the site specificity. So if you as an academic research institution, you have access to your own lab, that's where the lab work's being done, but you're using your affiliated hospital, that might be the enrolling site. And so it's just a way to sort of outline those in an organizational way. But they do warn you that you should not include any information that might also be included in your bio sketches. So it's less emphasis on the individuals conducting the study. So I wanted to highlight a couple of the protection of human subjects rules to clarify that document a bit. So the sections involved in this document are risks to human subjects, and this is where you describe their involvement, the human subjects characteristics, brief description of the study design, and then you talk about the study procedures, any materials to be collected, and then potential risks associated with that study. Section 2 is adequacy of protection against those risks. So this includes a description of how you are going to obtain informed consent and/or assent. You do not have to include the consent forms, but if you have blank consent forms, you may include them as appendix material in your application. You need to talk about protections against the risks that you have mentioned in the previous section. And then there's a special caveat for vulnerable subjects. So if you were recruiting pregnant women, neonates, incarcerated individuals, you should have extra protections in place, and this is a special section for you to be able to discuss that. Afterwards, potential benefits of the proposed research, both to the research participants as well as others. Even if there's no direct benefit, you can say that. And just to let you know, incentives or payments for participants to participate is not considered a benefit. And then at the end, you want to talk about the importance of the knowledge to be gained, just to make sure and to emphasize to your reviewers that the potential benefits or knowledge to be gained will outweigh any potential risks to the human subjects that are participating in your research. So after human subjects, if you've also determined that your human subject study is also a clinical trial, there's another section of requirements that you need to fill out, and so we're going to talk about those next. We call this the protocol synopsis section. So the first thing is a brief summary. It's limited to, I believe, 5,000 characters, and this should really be a lay summary about what your study is going to be about. Essentially, if your clinical trial is funded, you'll be required to register it with clinicaltrials.gov. It'll ask you for a brief summary, and this will be made available to people on the clinicaltrials.gov website. So in order to provide some additional information, you also have to include the study design. So you have a chance to provide a narrative and study description, which is essentially a protocol overview. They explicitly ask not for the entire protocol, but really just a detailed overview. You can have up to 32,000 characters for that. So it's a couple pages of information, but certainly not the entire protocol itself. This is also a text field, and so you can't include any special characters, graphics, tables, etc. It's really narrative in nature. You have to define what the primary purpose of the study is, so whether it's diagnostic, prevention, screening, etc. And you have to list all of the interventions that are going to be included in the study. You then have to define what study phase your study is in. So a lot of behavioral outcome studies might not fit into any of the clear NIH-defined phase 1, 2, 3 studies. So they have this additional option of other. If you select other, then you have to provide a really brief, I think 100-character description of why your study doesn't fall under a typical phase, and you could just write something like, this is a behavioral outcome study. The intervention model, so is it single group, parallel, etc. Do you have any masking? So if yes, then you select who's being blinded. Is it participant, care provider? It's a multi-select box, so if you have multiple blindings, you can check off any and all that are involved in that. And then the allocation question is really just asking if the study is randomized or not, so yes or no. Outcome measures also have to be included. You're required to have at least one outcome measure, but you can have multiples, of course. And again, this is meant to parallel what's being required of you in the clinicaltrials.gov website once your study is funded. So it's asking you to define ahead of time what you believe your outcome measures are that you're going to be measuring throughout the study. Statistical power and design is a new section as of 2018, where you are required to include a detailed description of the statistical design and power externally from the research strategy. So if you're submitting an R01, you have the 12 pages, you used to include statistical design and power in that section. Now they're really asking you for an overview of your methods and analysis, but now you have a separate document where you can go into really full detail about this. And again, because there's no page limitation, it can be as detailed as it needs to be, with the caveat that you are not supposed to be repeating or duplicating any information that might otherwise be in the research strategy. If it's applicable to your study, there's now a separate upload for any FDA, IND, or IDE products that you might be using. And then if your study is a clinical trial, you are required to have a dissemination plan. And this is not dissemination in the sense that you're going to, publish articles and present at conferences and go out to the community. All that's well and good. That's more something that was going to be included in your resource sharing plan or your narrative itself. The dissemination plan is really, how are you going to ensure that you are compliant with the clinicaltrials.gov registration requirements? So who's responsible for it? Is it the PI? Is it study coordinator working under the PI? Does your institution have a policy in place that ensures this compliance, et cetera? So it's really specific to the clinical trials registrations. So after all of that, it, it kind of sounds like that's a lot, right? So the NIH does allow for you to budget the costs that are associated with the collecting and reporting of clinicaltrials.gov information. So just a reminder, in case you don't think about it, you can certainly budget this into your budget. So they give you an estimated number of hours that you think this should take, and the cost is really determined on who's doing it. So it's the PI, it's the study coordinator, et cetera. But just keep in mind that if your clinical trial does get funded, you are required to report it. That does take time, and NIH recognizes that. And so just use this as a guidance for how you want to budget it into your grant application so that you're not stuck at the end of the study, having to incur those costs on your own because it wasn't budgeted in the overall application itself. So a lot of questions that we get in my office are, how is the human subject section reviewed? Because of there's all these different components and different requirements. Some are documents, some are text field. Sometimes there's more than one study record for a single application. So just to give a broad overview, the human subject section is not included in the overall score, but it's sort of judged pass-fail. So it's either acceptable or unacceptable. And as they've always done, reviewers are looking at the use of human subjects. Is it justified in regards to the risks, to the protections, the potential benefits, et cetera? So all of the information that you've already included and all of the documents from protection of human subjects, data and safety monitoring plans, et cetera. If you have a study and you think the study is exempt from human subject protections, they're going to be reviewing the justification of that exemption, the involvement and characteristics of the human subject population, and then the sources of materials that are being provided. For inclusion of women, minorities, and across the lifespan, they're going to be reviewing is the use or exclusion justified in terms of the research plan. So there must be a scientific reason for excluding women, any racial, ethnic categories, any ages. If you have a specific focus on an age, then you should have a scientific justification for that. And all of that goes into that document. And so they're just really reviewing whether it's whether your exclusions or inclusions are justified with the information that you've provided. So here at the UCLA CTSI, we have a number of resources that are available to help walk you through these in much more detail. So we have interactive collection forms that are available online. We have web pages for all of the NIH requirements, including human subjects. The ResarchGo website also walks you through study design, et cetera. There's a lot of boilerplate and examples of standard NIH application components, including some of the human subject stuff. CTSI also offers biostatistical support for helping with the statistical design and power section. My office, the Grant Submission Unit, also offers free consultations, and we can help walk you through determining whether your study is a clinical trial or not, and also helping you review those specific requirements that you're going to be putting together for the application. And then on top of that, because we are part of the CTSA network, we also have access to the Trial Innovation Network, which can help with multi-site clinical studies. So the website provided here is a link to all of the human subjects application requirements that I've discussed. And if you were unsure or wanted more details on any of the components, we have separate guidelines on each and every one of those. And the collection forms also walk you through what the unique requirements are for each of those separate components. So a little bit more detail on the Trial Innovation Network. This is available through the CTSA consortium through NCATS, and every CTSA, including ours, has a Trial Innovation Network liaison who can help connect you with experts for anything from standard agreements for study startup, if you need help operationalizing, implementing single IRB, study recruitment. They offer engagement studios. We perform EHR-based cohort assessments, and even provide guidance and support on data and safety monitoring. So basically, anything that you might be struggling with in terms of a multi-site trial or study and getting it off the ground, the Trial Innovation Network is there to help you. Our website is in the lower right corner here that you can visit for more details on each of these specific components, and you can email us. We also have office hours that I'll show at the end as well. For research studies, whether you're applying for research or you already have a study and you need help getting it off the ground. CTSI's ResarchGo website is sort of a single source to help you provide guidance on study design, study setup, conducting the study, closing it out as well. If you need access to things like study coordinators or data and safety monitoring board, FDA consultations, all of these are available on the ResarchGo website. So that website is in the lower right-hand corner as well, which I encourage you to visit if you have those particular questions for your study. Lastly, the grant submission unit, you can reach us by phone, email, visit us on the website. We have open office hours every week, typically on Tuesdays and Thursdays, as long as there's no holidays. And those, you're just welcome to stop by with any grant application related questions, whether it's about human subjects, clinical trials, about your biosketch, anything like that. We'll always have our door open to help you with those questions. But I do encourage you to visit the website, look at the resources, check out what's available for studies. If this is your first time planning a human subject study or clinical trial, or you're really not sure with all the updates that NIH has made, take a look at that and then get back to us if you have any questions, because we are always here to help you. So thank you, and we look forward to working with you soon.